and welcome to our Easter book group. So the book I'm going to talk about this time is a book called The Women, and it's written by an American author called Kristen Hanna, who I hadn't heard of before, but it seems she's written a lot of books, so I enjoy this one so much I'll probably read some more. This one starts in 1966, and it starts with a very extravagant party in a big house on a place called Coronado Island in California. Frankie, who is the main protagonist throughout this, she's 20 years old, and this is her parents' house, and she lives there with her parents and her brother. And they're having this massive party because her brother is going off to serve in Vietnam. He's with the Navy. So he goes off. She is trained as a nurse, and she's finding life a little bit dull, particularly now her brother's gone away. And so she thinks that she will enroll in the Navy and go off to Vietnam to serve as a nurse in the hospital units out there. So she applies to the Navy, and they turn her down, and she applies to the Air Force, and so do they, because she doesn't have the relevant experience. But the Army say, yes, she can go and work in the hospitals out there. They're pretty desperate for people to go. And so she goes, and it's obviously a massive culture shock, which I don't think she was really expecting. She ends up just, oh gosh, and it's so hot, and she's in this terrible, like a dormitory with other nurses. She's constantly being called into the surgical units, and it's just horrendous, as you can imagine. She forms quite a tight bond with two of the other nurses there, and that continues throughout the book. So even when she comes back to America eventually, these two nurses that she forms the bond with feature quite strongly. It's quite harrowing, a lot of it. Obviously people coming in with terrible injuries, some of the Vietnamese, lots of children involved. So obviously, and I don't know why she's surprised, but she finds it very harrowing. There's a lot going on. If you've ever seen MASH, it's a little bit like, one of the reviews I read was it's a little bit like MASH, but substitute the male doctors for women, essentially. And that's what.
And do we know how old she is in this?
Yes, she's 20 years old.
Right.
So she's very young, very young, yeah. Almost the minute she gets to Vietnam, she finds that her brother's been killed.
Right.
Which obviously doesn't help.
Yeah.
There's a lot of socialising between them, so she meets a lot of the doctors there. There's a lot of romance. She's falling in love with doctors. And
is it a book that's written in the first person?
No.
It's not?
No, it isn't, no.
It sounds like there are obviously a lot of her personal thoughts and what have you.
Yeah, no, it isn't.
So having sort of, I suppose, embroiled herself in one of these MASH units, does she blossom? Does she grow up? Or
she
does.
She
do the opposite?
She does. She has a really hard time to begin with because she's not really long since qualified, being 20 years old. And she gets a bit of a hard time, particularly from the sort of more senior doctors there who, sort of walk around thinking they're God and everybody should be worshipping them. And they treat the nurses quite badly. Because she's thrown in at the deep end and there's these horrific injuries coming in that she obviously wouldn't see back home as a general nurse. She learns really quickly, and she does become a bit of a linchpin in there. And
so becomes hardened to it, or not really?
Not really. She never really does become hardened to it. She just becomes really good at it.
Right.
And she's one of the nurses that the doctors rely on. One of the guys that she does meet, I don't know if he's a doctor, I can't quite remember, is somebody that her brother served with. And she ends up having a relationship with this man and falls in love with him. Eventually she comes back to America, and she thinks he's dead. She thinks he's been killed. But then she sees on a list somewhere that he's actually coming back to America, so she goes to meet him off the plane, I guess, that he comes back on. But instead of running to her, he runs to his wife and child, and that's where she finds out that he was actually married.
Right.
Which was a bit of a blow, you can imagine. The rest of the book, really, when she comes back to America, and this is something I didn't really know, is that when these people came back to America, because of the feeling in America at the time about the Vietnam War, she came back thinking that she was going to be a hero, whatever. And she wasn't. People spat at her in the street, and they called her a baby killer. And I guess that's because of the Vietnam War history, which I don't actually really know about.
Well, I think, in the late 60s and early 70s, especially in student campuses, the movement against the war was huge.
Yeah.
And as you say, initially, a lot of the GIs coming back were horrified at what they were coming back to.
Yes, they thought they were going to be lauded, but they weren't at all.
Yeah. And so is the book 80% Vietnam, 20%
No, it's
when
about
she's back,
50-50, I think. I would say about 50-50. When she comes back, because she's been so affected by it, I guess you'd call it PTSD these days, she has a really hard time settling back into the
And
life.
is she back in Civvy Street now?
Yes.
Or she's still like?
Originally she's back in Civvy Street, but then she decides to go back into nursing. But she finds it really hard, and she seeks help from some of the vets societies, essentially. But she's always turned away on the basis that there were no women in Vietnam.
Really?
You know, she goes to ask for help, sort of, I guess, like counselling type help.
Yes.
And it's all men that she's talking to, and they just say, well, there were no women in Vietnam.
Bizarre.
So I guess because they weren't serving as on the front line, if you like.
Yes, I don't know if the nursing staff in Vietnam were generally civilians working for the army or were actually army personnel. I have no idea at all.
No, I don't know. But yeah, she has quite a hard time. She starts drinking and smoking and generally having a pretty rough time. She's absolutely traumatised by this guy that she thought she was going to marry. You know, she found he was still alive when she thought he was dead, and then she had this sort of body blow of finding that he was...
And I presume at this point she's still in her, mid-20s?
Yes, gosh, yes. So she goes back into nursing, but she makes some terrible mistakes, and she keeps getting fired from her job, and her relationship with her parents breaks down. Her father's ashamed that she's went out there.
Really?
Yeah, she was a proper daddy's girl, and her father, in fact, had a sort of hero's wall in his study, and he had pictures of his son on there and from his past. And she wanted to know why she wasn't there, and he said he'd actually told everybody that she had gone to Italy to study for 2 years.
Really?
And she hadn't been to Vietnam at all. He was totally ashamed of the fact that she'd gone there.
Because he was a pacifist, or...?
No, because he was a man.
Oh, I see. Good grief.
Yeah.
Good grief.
So the rejection from her father, her mother, again, was quite sort of high in society there, and she was a little bit ashamed of her too. So she just found it really hard to sort of settle back into a normal life.
And without sort of giving away what happens, does she resolve this with her parents?
She does eventually, yes. It's a bit of a rocky road. She hooks up with the girls that were, the sort of close-knit trio of...
Right.
And they're a massive help. They sort of bail her out whenever she's having a hard time. And ultimately, it's quite a happy ending. So I won't give it away as to what happens. But it's quite a roller coaster ride, and a lot of it's a difficult read because a lot of it's set in these hospital units where there's terrible, terrible things happening, particularly when there are children involved. It's really not an easy read. But ultimately, it's a great read because it does, the ending is a happy one.
And do you know anything about the author? Was she in the forces? Was she in nursing? Or?
No, I don't think so. The introduction is that she's researched it a lot and she's spoken to a lot of people that did go out to Vietnam. Right. But no, she herself didn't. But I think she wanted to just highlight the fact that that's why it's called The Women, that there were women there and they did an amazing job and they really weren't recognised for what they did.
Fascinating.
But yeah, it's a good read. It's, as I say, quite harrowing but happy as well. And
good.
Yeah, I would highly recommend it.
Well, the book that I'm going to be talking about is this book. Now, he needs no introduction at all, of course, Michael Palin. And it's a fascinating book. It's called Erebus, The Story of a Ship. And actually, the sort of subtitle is really, really important because Michael Palin's book follows the entire life of a HMS ship. I think it was 1826 it was launched, a sailing ship, although of course there were steam vessels by this time. And the book follows the course of this ship under different commands, mainly to do with polar exploration. So this ship was initially captained, I think, by Captain James Clark Ross, who did a lot of Antarctic exploration, and most of the life of the ship was in the polar regions, and he went with crews really for charting all the polar regions. But what's so fascinating about this book is when it says the history of a ship, it really is. It's the history of the people on board, life on board the ship, and it goes into great detail and fascinating, really interesting detail as to everything from sort of the ship's boy, what they did, the different crew members, the research teams on board the ship as well, and it is just incredibly interesting as a picture of history, even without the book itself. And what's so interesting is that Michael Palin specifically for this book, visited different islands and parts of the world, including the polar regions, and ended up talking to, great or great grandchildren of individuals who had met some of the characters on board. And, having watched obviously Michael Palin on the television, and his writing brings it to life. It really does, but in an incredibly sort of genial, humble way. And what I found, it only really sort of dawned on me about halfway through the book, was that the Erebus was the sister ship of the Terror. Now, I think BBC had a series a little while ago called Terror, and it followed the ship Terror and Erebus as they both sought to find the Northwest Passage. And okay, there was a lot of dramatisation about Terror at the time, but I don't know if you saw any of it at all.
Is that the one that got stuck in the ice?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
but a gripping series. But obviously it really sort of focused on a few individuals, mainly on Erebus's sister ship Terror. But what of course happened was that both the ships disappeared. Now, it was only in, I think, about the 1990s that a wreck was found on the floor of the frozen sea off the northeast coast of Canada, which turned out to be Erebus, and it was quite intact. And they were fascinating artifacts on board. But it's more than a book chronicling the life of a ship and its journeys. It chronicles the lives of the different individuals, how they relate to the Admiralty back in England, because of course that fateful and final journey, which was captained by John Franklin, was, as I say, its final journey, and he was a very controversial character. He'd had a lot of expeditions that had gone terribly wrong, and at the age of 60 he was appointed by the Admiralty for this expedition. And of course, again, with the film or television series Terror, it focuses quite a lot on the efforts of his, widow, although she didn't really accept it, to keep fighting for search parties to go out looking for them. But it's an incredibly absorbing book,
Sounds like it.
which you don't really have to have any great knowledge or sort of want to explore polar exploration, because it is so much more than that. It's a very human book about the different lives and the stories.
I was going to say, does it focus on the people that were on the boats, the individual characters?
Very much so. It focuses on some of the characters, admittedly mainly those in command, but also on the day-to-day life and machinations of the ship, and incredible insight into what it was like then. So I found it a wonderful book, and Michael Palin tells it so very
He's
well.
amazing, isn't he?
He really is.
And everything
He's
he
just,
does makes...
It is just, he does it with a lovely sort of laconic style, which totally absorbs you. So a book I wouldn't necessarily have picked up.
You can ask on Audible, maybe?
Yes.
If he was reading it.
I think he does read it on Audible,
Okay.
so I'm sure it would be lovely. So yes, that's the book that I've recently read, Erebus. But the real truth is the story of a ship. Really, really interesting.
Sounds fab.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in with another one quickly just before we go, because Justine isn't here, so I'm going to sneak in and take her place now. This is just a book, not for everybody probably, but it's by Judi Dench, and it's called Shakespeare. Now, I'm not a big Shakespeare fan. I know a lot of people aren't. But this it's a lovely book. It's got lovely illustrations in the front by Judi Dench. And the whole book is a very long conversation. It's a fellow actor of hers asked her to just sit down and talk about, I think she's played every female role in Shakespeare. She's been doing it for 70 years, believe it or not. And this is just, it takes it takes it play by play. The first one is Macbeth, which I do actually know a little bit about because we did it at school. But it just sort of puts it in a nutshell. So it's Macbeth, what happens in Macbeth? And she's doing it from Lady Macbeth's point of view because that's the character that she's played. But it takes all of the plays, Twelfth Night, Merchant of Venice, all these plays that you hear about and you know the names of, but you don't really know what they're all about. And she just talks it through with this person. As I say, it's just a conversation. He asks the questions, she answers them, and it's just one very long interview book. But it just takes each play and puts it in a nutshell, what the plot is, what the story is, and then she sort of interjects with anecdotes about where she played, say she was playing in Stratford or the Old Vic or anywhere, the people she was playing with, little funny things that happened.
Interesting, her anecdotes, because I haven't read Shakespeare since school.
No, neither have I.
And even then we only did 2 or 3 plays, I can't remember. And it's never appealed to me, the idea of picking it up.
No.
Because when one has, all the few occasions, gone to a Shakespeare play, it takes me about half an hour to tune my ears into what's going on.
No, these are just her anecdotes about playing and the actors that she played with, Anthony Hopkins, Richard Burton, all those people. Yes. Funny things that have happened on the stage, and just really her life in Shakespeare. But it's a little potted version of each of the plays, so you come away with the feeling of, oh gosh, I know what that's all about now. Right. You hear about all these characters and suddenly they're all put into context. But it's just, if you love Judi Dench, it's just a really lovely book. I'm just really enjoying it. What I've done is, on YouTube, there's an interview with Judi Dench and this chap. I can't remember his name now, but I'll put a little link at the bottom. It's about 20 minutes. So if you've got 20 minutes to spare, it's just a really lovely thing to listen to and to watch. I would recommend that, even if you're not a Shakespeare fan.
Super. Brilliant.
Okay, that's it for...
Excuse me. Hope everyone has a lovely rest of the Easter holiday.
Yes.
And we'll look forward to seeing you all
next time.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, bye.